Experience. We live in a time where effort is often mistaken for value, where the louder you shoot, the more you must care. But the masculine doesn't operate like that. Experience. His strength isn't in how loudly he demands attention. It's in how clearly he understands his own energy and how quietly he pulls back when something doesn't align. You see, experience. Masculine energy doesn't chase. Not because it's cold, but because it's clear. It doesn't pursue validation because it's already grounded in self-worth. It doesn't beg, plead, or perform. Experience. It doesn't leave 13 messages in a row. It doesn't analyze every silence or wait for crumbs of affection. The masculine doesn't chase because it knows that love, when it's right, experience doesn't need to be hunted. It's invited, it's welcomed, it's mutual. Now, don't confuse this with a lack of desire or disinterest. The masculine feels deeply, but he chooses not to act from panic. Experience. Not from fear, not from the need to secure someone at the cost of losing himself. He moves with intention, not to prove he's worthy, but because he already knows he is. Experience. There is a kind of quiet power in that. A man who knows himself doesn't need to shout his value into the world. He expresses it in presence, in steadiness, in how he listens more than he interrupts. Experience. In how he observes before he acts. And when he acts, it's deliberate, not impulsive, impulsive. But we've created a culture where the person who runs harder is seen as the one who loves more. Experience. So when he doesn't chase, he's called cold. When he walks away, he's called weak. Experience. But here's the truth. It takes far more strength to walk away from misalignment than to stay and try to force something that was never rooted in respect. Desperation is loud. Presence is silent. Experience. And the masculine moves from the latter. That's why when he senses games, when he notices that he's being tested, manipulated, or pulled into emotional inconsistency, he doesn't push harder. Experience. He pauses, he recalibrates, he watches, and sometimes, yes, he disappears. Not as a weapon not to punish, but because he refuses to deplete himself for love that isn't meeting him halfway. Love for him, experience, is a mirror, not a chase. It's not about winning someone over. It's about resonance, alignment, a kind of emotional rhythm where both people want to be there, not because they're afraid of being alone. Experience, but because they see each other, really see each other, and still choose to stay. When the masculine stops chasing, it's not because he no longer cares. It's because he's finally caring for himself. Experience. He stops pursuing when he realizes that the pursuit has become a performance. When he feels that his presence is being tolerated rather than treasured. Experience. And that moment, when he pulls back, is not a collapse, it's a return to center, to self, to the stillness that tells him you don't have to run after what doesn't see you. Experience. You don't have to explain your worth. You don't have to convince anyone to choose you. Because when someone truly wants to be chosen, they don't hide behind silence. Experience. They don't create distance to increase desire. They step in. They match energy. They meet you where you are. So, no, the masculine doesn't chase. He moves with clarity. He stays when it's safe. Experience. And he disappears when his presence becomes a question mark instead of a full body yes. That's not ego. That's integrity. When someone pulls away from us, our first instinct is often to take it personally. Experience. We feel rejected, unchosen, maybe even abandoned. But what if that silence isn't an attack? What if that withdrawal isn't meant to hurt, but to preserve? Disappearing is so often misunderstood. Experience. We call it ghosting, avoidance, emotional unavailability. And yes, sometimes that's exactly what it is. But sometimes disappearing is not about games. It's about survival. It's about self-respect. Experience. It's about a boundary being drawn not in words, but in absence. Because there comes a point when a man realizes staying in this dynamic is costing me more than it's giving. Experience. When love becomes a performance he's expected to keep delivering without nourishment in return, something inside him begins to shut down, not out of cruelty. Experience. But because he knows he cannot keep offering his presence in a space that doesn't know how to receive it. This is not about punishing the other person. It's not a way of saying, you hurt me, experience, so I'll hurt you back. No, it's a quiet decision to stop leaking energy, to stop negotiating for connection, to stop offering pieces of himself to someone who doesn't know how to hold them gently. Experience. Disappearing can be an act of incredible clarity. It's the moment he chooses not to fight, to stay in a room where his voice is no longer heard. It's when he stops calling, not out of bitterness, experience, but because he knows he deserves to be wanted, not tolerated, not tested, not used as proof that someone is still desirable. We often ask, why did he leave? But rarely do we ask experience. What was happening that made staying feel impossible? Emotional misattunement doesn't always show up as screaming matches or dramatic breakups. Sometimes it's much quieter experience. It's in the constant need to prove himself, in the feeling of being wrong even when he's being honest, in the weight of love that feels more like a job than a joy. And so he disappears. Not to inflict pain, experience, but to reclaim peace. There is a point when words no longer work, when explanations feel exhausting, when defending your needs starts to sound like begging. And in that moment, experience. Silence becomes a form of self respect. A man who chooses to walk away rather than betray himself is not being weak. He is being deeply, painfully honest. Experience. There is also a difference between disappearing and vanishing. One is reactive, the other is reflective. A man rooted in emotional depth doesn't run to escape conflict. But if the connection becomes one sided experience, manipulative or emotionally unsafe, he will remove himself. Not because he doesn't care, but because he cares too much to stay in something that's turning him into someone he no longer recognizes. You see, experience. Love without reciprocity is erosion. It chips away at confidence. It fogs clarity. It teaches someone to settle for less while hoping for more. Experience. And there comes a moment when the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the relationship is to stop showing up in a space that no longer holds you with care. So when he disappears, experience. Don't always ask what's wrong with him. Ask what became so wrong in the connection that disappearing felt like the only honest move left. Because when a man walks away with dignity, it isn't cruelty, experience. It's clarity. In every romantic connection, whether we realize it or not, there's a dance, a tension between closeness and space, giving and receiving, leaning in and leaning back, experience. This dance is what creates desire. It's what sustains intrigue. It's what keeps us drawn to each other, not of needness, but out of choice. But when one partner begins to chase, the rhythm collapses. Experience. The dance turns into a chase scene. One person is leading, while the other is running, not toward, but away. Masculine energy at its core is about direction, focus. Groundedness, it leads not through force, experience, but through clarity. And feminine energy is receptive. Magnetic, fluid, expansive. When these two energies are in balance, they create polarity. The spark, the chemistry, experience. The gravitational pull that draws two people together. But chasing disrupts this natural current because the moment he begins to chase, he shifts out of leadership and into pursuit. And pursuit, experience. When it becomes desperate, erodes respect. It blurs intention. It replaces magnetism with pressure. A masculine man understands this deeply. He doesn't confuse love with pursuit. Experience. He knows the difference between approaching someone with interest and running after someone who is emotionally unavailable. Experience. When he feels the dynamic shift, when he notices that he's being made to prove his worth or compete for attention, he doesn't intensify the chase. He steps back. Not out of pride, but out of wisdom, experience. Because when he chases, he isn't just chasing a person, he's chasing validation, approval, control, and in doing so, he loses himself. He becomes anxious, reactive, disconnected from his core, experience. The very qualities that made him attractive in the first place begin to erode. There's something subtle but powerful in knowing how to hold your energy. To stay rooted, experience, even when the other person becomes distant. Not everything that pulls away needs to be, but sometimes it's an invitation to pause, to realign, experience, to check whether the connection is truly mutual or just another game of emotional tug of war. Chasing also creates an imbalance of power. The chaser begins to shrink, adapt, perform, experience, and the one being chased may start to withhold, test, or manipulate, not always consciously, but from a place of uncertainty. Suddenly, the relationship becomes a negotiation, not a collaboration, experience, a test of how much someone is willing to lose themselves just to be chosen. But love is not earned through sacrifice of self. It's revealed through presence, through reciprocity, experience, through two people showing up, not to fill a void, but to explore something meaningful together. That's why a man who is in his healthy masculine energy does not chase. He initiates. He invites experience, but he doesn't force. He's available but not needy. He's expressive but not performative. And if the connection begins to lose balance, he won't fight to keep it alive alone. Experience. He steps back to allow the other person to meet him or not, because desire cannot be dragged out of someone. It must be chosen freely, willingly, with joy, not pressure, experience. When a man respects the polarity of a relationship, he doesn't try to dominate it. He honors the tension that makes it beautiful. He doesn't chase, he allows. And in doing so, Experience. He creates space for love to flow toward him, not because he demanded it, but because he stayed rooted long enough to receive it. That's not detachment, that's power. Experience. There is something deeply calming about clarity, something undeniably attractive about a person who knows what they want and is willing to speak it with honesty. Masculine energy doesn't thrive in chaos. Experience. It doesn't find aliveness in uncertainty. It wants depth, yes, it wants connection, but not at the cost of losing clarity. When a man is rooted in his self-worth, experience, he no longer tolerates the constant fog of confusion that many relationships get caught in. He doesn't stay in dynamics where he has to guess whether he's wanted. He doesn't decode mixed signals like riddles. Experience. He doesn't confuse being emotionally tested with being emotionally valued. Because confusion isn't romantic, it isn't mysterious, it isn't a sign of passion or intensity. Confusion over time, experience, becomes erosion. It wears down a man's integrity, his leadership, his calm. And when that happens, he begins to shrink inside the relationship. Not because he's weak, experience, but because he's being asked to constantly question himself in a place that's meant to feel like home. The masculine doesn't resist complexity, but it rejects inconsistency. There's a difference. Experience. Complexity invites depth, curiosity, dialogue. Inconsistency invites anxiety, self-doubt, and a constant chasing of emotional crumbs. And when a man senses that he is being pulled into that spiral, he pauses. Experience. He doesn't push harder. He doesn't chase faster. He gets quiet. He gets still. And he asks, is this connection growing me or is it distracting me from myself? So often, experience. We're taught that if someone is unclear, it's our job to fix it, to be more charming, to try harder, to wait for the breakthrough. But a man in his center knows that love should not feel like a maze. Experience. He doesn't need to prove himself to be chosen. He only needs to show up honestly. If that honesty is met with confusion, withdrawal, or emotional games, he doesn't blame himself. He simply stops engaging. Experience. Because clarity isn't just something we offer others, it's something we require in return. It's how we know whether love is growing or just lingering. Experience. Whether someone is building with us or simply borrowing our energy while they figure themselves out. There's a kind of relief that comes when a man lets go of unclear dynamics. Experience. When he stops giving his emotional labor to situations that only drain him. When he realizes that walking away from confusion is not a failure. It's a commitment to sanity, to emotional sobriety. Experience, to a love that feels clean. A masculine man doesn't need perfection. He doesn't need someone to have all the answers. But he needs transparency. He needs emotional truth. Experience. He needs to feel like his presence is met with intention, not hesitation. He doesn't want to pull teeth just to get someone to be real with him. He wants a space where the truth can breathe. Experience. And when he doesn't find that, when the energy feels too cloudy, too chaotic, too wrapped in mixed messages and passive-aggressive tests, he doesn't rage. He doesn't argue. Experience. He doesn't beg for understanding. He simply chooses peace. Not because he stopped caring, but because he started caring differently. For himself, for his boundaries. Experience, for the kind of connection that doesn't require confusion to feel exciting. Because when a man knows his value, he doesn't get addicted to chaos. He chooses clarity every time. Experience. There is a version of him that once stayed too long, that tolerated the waiting, the mixed signals, the emotional push and pull. He stayed because he hoped. Experience. Because he believed love could be repaired if only he tried hard enough, if only he held on tighter, if only he kept showing up. But then something shifted. Experience. He realized that effort alone doesn't guarantee intimacy, that consistency cannot grow in soil that keeps shifting beneath his feet. Experience. That loving someone should not require losing himself over and over just to feel worthy of their affection. And so he disappeared not because he gave up, but because he woke up. You see, experience. The right man doesn't disappear to vanish. He disappears to evolve, to upgrade, to leave behind the version of himself that begged to be seen. Experience. And step into the version of himself that knows he doesn't need to perform to be valuable. There's a moment when staying feels heavier than leaving. Experience. Not because he doesn't care, but because the cost of care without return starts to feel like a kind of slow emotional death. He begins to recognize the patterns, the emotional breadcrumbs. Experience, the cycles of closeness and withdrawal, the way his love is only fully received when it's at risk of being taken away. And that moment becomes his turning point. He doesn't ghost. He doesn't punish. Experience. He simply pulls his energy back into himself. He starts to nourish what was neglected while he was too busy trying to be enough for someone else. He stops proving, stops performing, stops pretending. Experience. And in that quiet withdrawal, something powerful happens. He upgrades his standard. Because the man who disappears doesn't just leave a person, he leaves a dynamic experience, a version of himself that once accepted emotional ambiguity as love, a belief that struggle equals connection. He upgrades his self, respect, his emotional intelligence, experience, his capacity to wait for something aligned rather than entertain what's convenient. And that shift, that upgrade, changes how he loves forever. He no longer stays in places that confuse him. Experience, he no longer explains his needs 12 different ways just to be misunderstood. He no longer bends his truth to avoid conflict. Instead, he honors it. He tells himself the truth, experience, that love isn't supposed to feel like a test you're constantly failing, that the right person doesn't need to be chased, convinced, or rescued from their own indecision. Experience. And here's what's beautiful. The man who upgrades returns to love with more to offer, not less. He's deeper now, calmer. He's not closed, he's clearer. He's not afraid to try again. Experience, but he won't try the same way. He won't bleed to be seen. He won't shrink to be accepted. He won't betray his own clarity just to avoid the discomfort of being alone. Experience. Because the right man, the one who knows his worth, doesn't disappear into bitterness, he disappears into better, into becoming. Experience. Into the kind of man who is no longer available for love that requires him to abandon himself. So when he disappears, don't assume he's avoiding you. Understand he may finally be choosing himself. Experience. He may finally be honoring what he should have honored long ago, not the potential of what could be, but the reality of what is. And when he reappears, it won't be to chase what he left behind. Experience. It will be to meet what's finally aligned. There is a kind of strength that doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't pound its chest. It doesn't chase or control. Experience. It sits quietly in a man who knows himself, who feels deeply, but refuses to be ruled by chaos. That strength is emotional sovereignty. It's the power to hold your own inner world with clarity, experience, with stability, without letting someone else's storm pull you into disarray. True masculinity is not how much you can dominate a situation, but how deeply you can stay centered within it. Experience. It's not the absence of emotion, it's the mastery of it. Not by shutting it down, but by feeling it fully, without needing to act impulsively from it. Experience. It's the ability to experience anger without becoming destructive, to feel desire without becoming dependent, to grieve without collapsing into self-pity. Experience. A sovereign man doesn't abandon his heart, he protects it. Not with walls, but with wisdom. He doesn't give it away to whoever reaches for it first. He chooses, intentionally, thoughtfully. Experience. He knows what his love is worth, and he gives it where it can breathe, not where it's suffocated. He doesn't need drama to feel alive. He doesn't mistake intensity for intimacy. Experience. He knows the difference between being needed and being valued. And this kind of man, he's not afraid of closeness. He's afraid of losing himself in connection that asks him to be less. Experience. He doesn't withdraw because he can't commit. He steps back when commitment starts to mean self-erasure. He listens to the signals, the subtle ones. Experience. The way his body tightens in conversations that aren't safe. The way his intuition whispers, this isn't love, it's performance. He pays attention not because he's paranoid, but because he's present. Experience. There was a time, maybe, when he would have stayed anyway, when he would have swallowed his truth, twisted himself into the shape someone else needed. But that time has passed, because now, experience, he understands that the cost of peace is too high when it's bought by pretending, and he refuses to pretend anymore. Emotional sovereignty is not disconnection. It's not indifference. It's the opposite. Experience. It's feeling everything, but not letting it own you. It's allowing space between stimulus and reaction. It's choosing your response rather than being swept into a storm you didn't create. And in love, experience, this shows up as a man who doesn't chase, he doesn't beg, he doesn't prove, he doesn't spiral. He brings calm, not coldness, presence, not pressure. Experience. He holds the container of the relationship with steadiness, but only when it's mutual. When the container leaks, when the energy becomes manipulative. Experience. When emotional clarity is replaced with control and confusion, he walks, because he knows that no relationship is worth trading his sovereignty for, no matter how beautiful, how passionate. Experience. How intoxicating the chemistry may be, it is never worth betraying his own boundaries just to keep the story alive. And so he loves with depth, but not with desperation. He feels with openness, experience, but not with recklessness. He commits not to avoid being alone, but because he's already whole. And from that wholeness he builds with clarity, with care, with courage. experience. Because real masculinity doesn't need to conquer, it simply refuses to be conquered.